I'm Michael Govan, CEO of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. I think I probably know a lot of you. It's great that you're here, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this conversation with really a renowned author, Walter Isaacson, about his recent biography. Finally, he's written about an artist. He has written about art before, but in his Genius series, as I call it, it's nice to see that Leonardo da Vinci is now prominently featured in his writing. And the biography is based on literally thousands of pages of notebooks as well as other information, but I know I want to talk with Walter about his careful review of Leonardo's notebooks. I think, as you all know, he's the author of many acclaimed works, including The Innovators of 2014, Steve Jobs' biography in 2011, Einstein in 2007, and Ben Franklin, just a few people we know. And he is also, in addition to being an author, he's a university professor of history at Tulane and president and CEO of the Aspen Institute until recently. He's also served as chairman of CNN and editor of Time magazine. Not a bad resume. There will be a book signing following this on the plaza at the LACMA store for a bit. And just as David McCullough, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, I read his Wright brothers book recently, said in his review of this book, to read this magnificent biography of Leonardo da Vinci is to take a tour through the life and works of one of the most extraordinary human beings of all time in the company of the most engaging, informed, and insightful guide imaginable. Walter Isaacson is at once a true scholar and a spellbinding writer. Please join me in welcoming Walter Isaacson. I'm so excited for this. As soon as I heard that, Walter, you were doing this biography of Leonardo da Vinci, I could not wait for it, in part because as a kid, I read all the notebooks that were available in facsimile. I taught myself to write backwards. Yeah. I made many drawings and poems based on Leonardo and his notebooks. So he's such a mysterious figure, and for me, again, more than the paintings, and I've seen every painting, the notebooks are the story of this, I guess we call him genius, but when did you decide that Leonardo would be your subject?
Well, you're
early
one
on?
of the people who understands how cool these notebooks are. And over the years, I've been writing about geniuses, and I thought it's because they're very smart. But after a while, you realize, no, smart people are a dime a dozen. What makes you a genius is being creative or thinking, imaginatively. And it's in Leonardo's notebooks that you see the combination of art and science that we're going to be talking about that makes him just change everything. I guess it was maybe 20 years ago I first stumbled across some of his notebooks when we were in Florence and then Venice. The cool thing about the notebooks is there are about 7,000 pages of them, but they're scattered in Florence, Venice, Milan, Paris, London, Windsor, Madrid, Seattle. So you're almost 8 out of 9 are like really great places to go to. You can try to figure out whether it was Milan or Seattle I don't like.
We'll have the Milan-Florence discussion. So you spent time. So just tell me how long was that process to see those? When did this journey begin?
It began 20 years ago with the Codex and the Flight of Birds, and then those would come over every now and then. The Morgan Library would do one in New York showing them, I think. And then it really crystallized when I was writing, before Steve Jobs, I was doing Einstein, but about to do Steve Jobs, and Bill Gates bought the Codex Leicester. And I don't want to name it, I don't know Bill Gates that well, but when you're editor of Time, people like Bill Gates are very friendly to you, like once or twice a year when they want to be on the cover of Time. And so he was showing me these notebooks, and his is a particularly cool one because it's about physics and geology and the flow of water, which is, to me, the primary pattern of nature that Leonardo loved.
And it also just to say, so you've now written enough books that is, I call it the genius series because you have systematically
And Michael
now
is next. I mean, that's where we're
no.
ending.
I was just about to say that everyone refers to you as a genius, so we will be waiting for your autobiography at some point.
That's the cool thing about writing about geniuses. It
You get
seems
some
to
good
rub off.
ideas?
People think you're smart,
No.
when in fact...
Many people think know you're a genius, actually, and I know that in Aspen because I have been to so many of the amazing conferences. And you seem to thrive on that curiosity about intelligence. And so I just have to ask, is this now an ongoing series? Have you found this sense that this exploration of these individuals, each of them quirky, different, is your passion now?
Yeah, well, first of all, like Leonardo, you discover patterns by observing it. I did not know this was a pattern. In fact, I did Ben Franklin, then Einstein, and Steve Jobs said, "Do me next," and I went, "Yeah, you arrogant." And then it was only later that I realized he was sick, but it was when I did him, and I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I always," Steve Jobs said this in my product presentations, with a street signs. I had seen it because I'd been to the original iPad and iPod launches, a street sign of the arts and technology. And he said, at that intersection is where creativity happens. And so there's a wonderful line in Lord of the Rings of Gandalf that all who wander are not lost. I realize I've been wandering on this path and kind of focused on it and realized that the biggest and greatest and most wondrous mountain to scale of this series of mountain ranges was, of course, Leonardo da Vinci, which gets to your question, do you do anybody next? Probably not. I think of this as the culmination of that series. I'm going to be moving down to my hometown of New Orleans. In fact, I've moved back. And I will probably do a book on race, jazz, and class in Storyville in New Orleans in the 1890s, which is not going to be part of the Genius series, but it's something I want to do because I'm interested in, well, yeah.
Well, so before getting into Leonardo specifically, since we are at an art museum and he's one of the most fascinating topics in the history of art, so these geniuses, you do seem to find patterns. At the end of this book, you make a list that we can talk about, but it seems to not just apply to Leonardo da Vinci. You make a list of things that are sort of a bit life lessons, but it seems like things you've discovered about genius, which is as much about curiosity and failure and experimentation as it is about success. One of the things that emerges to me very strongly, and maybe Einstein a little bit less so, but this multidisciplinary aspect. You talk about the story of how Steve Jobs, when I read that book, was in a design class and typography, that the value of design led him down this other course. And it seems like this, even at the turn of the century, the multidisciplinary is so deeply in the air that this quest for compartmentalized knowledge that has been since the Enlightenment is broken by the pattern of these geniuses who seem to just wander across those boundaries. Is that a fundamental?
Yeah, it's fundamental, and it's a cross currents of nature across those boundaries. I think that ever since the invention of the university system in Germany 400 years ago, where you have departments and you silo things, and then we teach our kids starting in approximately, like first grade, you silo math from music and everything else. And we do have to have disciplines that are different, but going cross-discipline to me has always been the way to see those beautiful patterns of nature. Let's take Leonardo and the river. As a little kid, he was lucky to be born out of wedlock, so they didn't send him to school. And he couldn't be a notary like his father and grandfather. He'd been a horrible notary. And so he's self-taught, but he's fascinated by when the water of the streams going to the Arno hit rocks, they kind of form swirls. Why do they form swirls? There's a lot to unpack even in that one thought as a little kid, which is, wow, I remember noticing that as a kid, and somehow we outgrow our wonder years and forget to ask or even observe. As I, watch water going into a bowl, why does it swirl? He does it his whole life. The Deluge Drawings at the end of his life, but at the very beginning when he's in Verrocchio's studio and helping with the baptism of Christ, and the water coming down from John the Baptist's cup, and then the River Jordan rippling past Christ's ankles, is perfectly scientifically accurate. And then he applies it when he decides that he and Machiavelli, I mean, what a dynamic duo that is. They want to divert the Arno River to make Florence a seaport for many reasons. One was to annoy Pisa, which was on the way downstream, but the other was because Columbus had this is 1494, they're just getting, we got to have a seaport, this is important. And then, the Mona Lisa, you see the curves of the river coming. And finally, when he's dissecting the human heart, most people thought the heart valve opens and shuts because the pressure as it comes out and then pressure goes down. No, it happens because the blood coming out of the main part of the heart into the ventricle goes into a smaller area, it swirls, and thus spreads out the membrane. He does that in like 15 notebook pages. He even devises a glass he puts grass seeds in it so he can experiment and see it. It was only about 20 years ago that they finally proved him exactly right through looking at a living heart through MRI where they inject iodine. Although my favorite of those, it's probably in there somewhere, is he's doing all of his drawings of the human heart. There on this, you see him over there doing all the experiments that you would do on the heart valve, how it does. This is the glass closed thing. And it's page after page in his mirror script that only Michael Govan has learned to copy. And then you get to the last page of it, and he's writing about it and everything else, and he draws the human heart here, but he can't pause for a moment and draws his companion, Salai, around the heart so that the heart's beating in Salai. He's human.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because that idea of the swirl, that his fascination, that is the one thing that comes through your entire book. And I really love the way that image from the putting the finger in the water, because I mean, that's both leads to this scientific discovery that you're saying, which is a rare one, right? He doesn't have so many absolutely fundamental scientific discoveries.
No, he was not as good of a scientist as he thought he was.
Right.
I hate to say it. But the heart valve is one. And this, by the way, is, early drawings. He just loved how water would flow into something and cause the swirls like that, water flowing past an obstacle. And sort of as an old man, still looking at the swirls of water. And Micah would know that the most famous of his final drawings was the Deluge Drawings, which show the torment in his soul, too.
Which is, by the way, that when one wants to authenticate a Leonardo painting and you write about the fights over the authentication of certain paintings, people immediately point to the swirls in the hair, right, as one of the key elements of his signature, and that comes right out of his fascination with water. And are you going to go to one?
I was just going to show a typical notebook page of Leonardo. It's there it is, very early on. And he has so many things he's trying to do. Square the circle, which is an ancient problem of getting a square the exact same area as a circle, using a ruler and a protractor. His old craggy warrior like but a tree that branches showing the way blood vessels branch. But because Michael was saying it, I was trying to get to here where he's doing swirls of air, swirls of water, a few stabs at the mathematics, by the way, of Fibonacci's equation that describe how a spiral works, and then the little curls of hair, which of course he so fondly loved, as his contemporary said, on his companion Salai, but he so fondly loved it in every painting he did. He had, as you know, Leonardo had flowing, curly hair that was blonde. And the coolest thing on this page, besides all the lists of things he wants to do, is right down here, because he does this page when he's about 34. He describes how to boil nuts in oil and put it on your hair as a tawny hair dye. So here we have him,
which
going
we might
gray,
want to try.
Yes, dyeing his hair blonde. I know nobody in this room has ever thought of doing that. These are Salai's curls. But among the things, this is a famous painting by Donato Bramante, who does himself here but this is Leonardo, and we see the curly, tawny hair.
So let's talk about that too, because this is his assistant boyfriend, got a complicated story in relation to Sally in his life. And you investigate his homosexuality in a really interesting way, I think, that is maybe only possible now.
Yeah, all sorts of previous writers on Leonardo, especially in the 19th century, and frankly, all the way through the 1950s, even Kenneth Clark and others, somehow or another, they're, unlike we are today, uncomfortable, just sort of saying, oh, he actually was attracted to men and had companions and was perfectly comfortable with it. Unlike Michelangelo, who's a near contemporary, who's also attracted to men and goes through the agony and the ecstasy because he's very religious and thinks it's horrible.
Right, and of course there was the famous and terrible Freudian analysis of Leonardo that threw so many people off for so long that want to look at the art within that frame of reference. And I think one of the nice things you do is separate out that from the qualities of the images and even his interest in the androgynous figure, which I think is a different kind of thing.
I'm so glad you said that because you obviously know this field so well, and everybody's trying to tie it in. That's why he did I said, no, let's just talk about the beauty of the androgynous figures, and that's part of his palette, so to speak. I don't need to psychoanalyze them. There are enough people willing to do, 500 years later, all the psychoanalysis. I'm just like, let me tell you what happened.
Well, there seems to be an awareness. I mean, the androgynous figure, you see it shows up even in Robert Mapplethorpe, for example, as an image to describe the complexity of gender identification, right? One
of the funny things is Dan Brown, who I kind of like his novels, and he wrote Da Vinci Code.
We'll discuss that later.
Yeah. Well, basically, in the Da Vinci Code, he says that, this, the Last Supper, that's not really John, that's Mary Magdalene, because it's clearly a woman. And Leonardo made a sharp distinction between the men he drew and the women he painted. It's like, no, that's John. We know that from, and secondly, Leonardo never made such distinctions. In fact, there's so many of his wonderful paintings that are very androgynous. I'll get to see if I get to a couple of them, but these are John. This
also
is
John.
John the Baptist. It's not Mary Magdalene, and then John the Baptist redone as Bacchus, but.
Can you hold there for a second? Well, also. The finger pointing, which you do, which appears again and again in the images, and we know that about Leonardo all the way to the point of when Raphael paints in the stanzas the frescoes in the Vatican. He paints the School of Athens and Plato with his finger up, which is often said to be a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. And so we walk backwards through these images, including the hand pointing that appeared and disappeared in another picture. Tell me more about that. I did want to know more about what you were thinking, because there is some analysis to be done of, and it's certainly been written about, of that pointing.
Especially near the end of his life, he's become a bit more spiritual, done Vitruvian Man, trying to figure out not only all of creation, but how do we fit into creation. And a lot of his final paintings have this gesture of someone pointing the way. It's sometimes very intoxicating. Even on the left with with John, it's alluring, somewhat of a come hither look. The hand comes closer to you, so the rules of perspective that Leonardo knew, it's both sharper and bigger. And then he does it again. And this is kind of, you talk about blurring the distinction between, despite what Dan Brown said, this is the angel pointing the way, but it's very androgynous. And so Salai, that boyfriend we keep talking about, does a sort of parody of it. But if you look, I'm sorry if it offends you, close your eyes, it has an erection, a very large erection there. So, but they're all pointing the way. So the pointing of the way is both, I call it Oh, I didn't mean that as a pun. I'm sorry. In fact, let me go back to, yes, right. Leonardo was interested, as I say, he was somewhat heretical, somewhat religious. We all know the type. But he does like the phrase, the word becomes flesh. And I think that's a little bit what he's showing, is that the intoxication of the flesh also has its spiritual quality.
So let's follow that, because you outline very well this broader philosophy of Leonardo's in the painting and the arts, this relationship between earth and human, right? That's somehow this through line, that's somehow for him, and this is a Renaissance idea that spirituality would be embedded not in the ethereal and immaterial, but this is kind of the revelation or the change of thought in the Renaissance. And you see it in art, you see it in poetry, you see it in science, that the material has this potential to hold the spirit.
Yeah, and that man and creation and the spirit can be one. Right. And that, I can do it in two ways. I do it with the Mona Lisa or with Vitruvian Man.
Why don't we go to Vitruvian Man,
okay,
if you can, because there's so much more to say about the Mona Lisa.
Because Vitruvian Man is actually one that I got totally geeked out on, and loved to live it. Well, I was actually gonna start. I'll try to do the story quickly, but to me the story is important, which is he begins because he wants to be an architect, and he's moved to Milan, and they ask him, along with some friends. He's very collaborative. He has all these mathematicians and Bramante and all these people are friends. They have this god-awful cathedral, this Gothic, but it doesn't have a tuburio, which is this lantern tower at the crossing. And so they ask a group of people, and Leonardo's part of the competition, to design it. Leonardo believes in simplicity. And what Vitruvius, the ancient Roman architect, said, the classical proportions of a human reflected in a church, which is not reflected in the Milan Cathedral. So Leonardo and his friends designed a very simple Greek cross-like thing, which clearly gets rejected because the Milan authorities had less taste than most people in this audience. He and Bramante were the two people working on it, and I said, there's Leonardo, flowing curls, cleft chin, purple and pink robes that were always short, as they contemporaries tell us, because he had a very well-proportioned body. And they cared about doing churches that were in sort of harmony, simple, and symmetrical, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And they read Vitruvius, who says it's supposed to reflect the proportions of a man. The one person in the crowd who really decides to reflect the proportions of a man is Leonardo. We have 230 measurements. Some of them exactly how far it is from the chin to the lip to the nose. All over the place, every part of the body, including a body in motion, standing still, page after page of these proportions. He's also trying to do something I mentioned briefly earlier, which is square the circle. He does it when he's a kid. He does it when he's this age, which is 1492, I think. So he's about turning 40. And, hundreds of times trying to get the square, we'll leave aside the math of it. It can't be done unless you can figure out pi as an irrational number, which he hasn't been able to do in all these pages. But they go to Pavia together. And they decide they're going to do the church that's perfectly proportioned. And in the Pavia Library, Castle Library, is one of the manuscripts of Vitruvius. And they all want to go see it. And then they all decide to draw it. Everybody thinks Vitruvian Man was, came out of nothing and Leonardo just did it. It was collaborative. And I don't think anybody's ever really focused on that. So you have his friends, you have Giacomo Andrea, you have Francesco Giorgi, you have Bramante. They're all trying out. How do you do a church with a man proportioned in it, the way Vitruvius says, with the genitals in the middle of the circle, navel square, all that sort of thing. Giacomo Andrea, we have a wonderful dinner party scene, July 1492, and they must be doing it then because it was like 3 days after they came back from Pavia. And Salai, I know I keep coming back to him, the little scamp of a boyfriend, breaks some plates by mistake and then spills wine at the dinner. So we have all this in the notebook, and we see these people trying to figure out how to do Vitruvian Man and not get spelled on by Salai's rudeness until finally, kaboom, Leonardo does it. And you can see the difference. First of all, it is exactly right in the science. Secondly, he's figured out the squaring of the circle thing. If you want the navel to be right in the center of the circle, the genitals to be in the center of the square, and you want to make it the exact same size, you have to take the circle and put it above the top of the square the way he does it. It's also a work of unnecessary beauty. I mean, you know, you go back to his friends, they're doing like stick figures, and there he is with the perfect shadings, everything, left-handed hatches, gorgeous. And then finally, let me say, look at that face. Who is it? It's Leonardo.
Could be, yes.
He is he is looking at how the world, the cosmos, and spirituality, and how he fits into it.
And this is, for me, as always, the greatest statement of the change of thinking in the Renaissance. I'm not the only person who thinks that, but it's both the willingness to seek out that text, right? First of all, that Vitruvius would be popular, again, that you would want
That's what
that
happens
text,
in the
right?
Renaissance. They discover these old classics, as you know. I mean, the Swerve, the wonderful Greenblatt book, where they discover Lucretius, and then these dudes help rediscover Vitruvius, the 10 Books of Architecture.
And then it's not just the going back to a greater age, but this is a great example of how observation in the Renaissance, I think Leonardo's being more modern, has this ability to really, it is an adjustment of Vitruvius.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not
Very good
absolutely true, and that it's absolutely just going back to the ancients, because that's always what's said. Well, the ancients were greater, and so we've devolved, and so we go back to the ancients. But this is a great example where only Leonardo's observation of anatomy, nature, statistical analysis allows him to create this adjustment and also see, I guess, to embed that notion. I mean, for him, beauty was that cosmic relationship, right?
It's a cosmic relationship between man and the earth and the cosmos and the spirit of how we fit into it. And as you said, it's why I showed these drawings and do it in the book. He's actually making his own measurements. And on this page, he says, Vitruvius teaches us that, and he goes through some of the proportions. And everybody says, oh, he's just mimicking Vitruvius. You look at it, and then you read Vitruvius. They're like 3/4 of them are totally different. Leonardo had made his own observations, which is what you just
Which
said.
has been, and it's this that's become the model of that kind of order, this drawing, this Leonardo taking, and he often seemed to do that, take fragments and then refine them to an extent that they become that something new.
Absolutely. He is one of those people, to me, this is a symbol for what you said, but it's also the great icon of the connection of art, science, and spirituality. And to me, that's why it's an emblem of Leonardo.
Maybe let's go to science. You could go to the next picture because, again, it's not as if Leonardo made many scientific discoveries. He was largely self-taught. You say he luckily was born out of wedlock. He made his own path. He did not become an accountant, although the note-taking was obviously in his blood, the notary sense of recording everything. It should be also said that the backwards writing is not as much about secrecy as it was about him being left-handed, and of course if you're painting or drawing with a quill brush, you would smear your ink if you're left-handed trying to draw this way, and it was popular in these days. He would write correctly when he had to make or the other way when he had to make a presentation, so this is really about his
But by the way, it's
style.
pretty amazing that you taught yourself to do that.
Well, it's not easy actually, but the play for me was the idea of it being seen in mirror, because mirrors were such a fascination of his. I mean, I know he liked writing backwards in part because of that play. He would design mirrors that would double. He used them for self-portraiture, for note-taking. And so that notion of seeing, it also, what's really beautiful about it is that for our eye, it separates the pictures and the text. So we see an illustration. I think this is one of the most powerful things. We see an illustration, which is note-taking and didactic, but because it's written backwards and obviously in another language, the pictures come forward, they become more decorative, you can decipher them, but they look more truly artistic.
And you know, if you're going to say what were some of his great scientific discoveries or inventions,
This is an invention.
yeah, the visual display of information, you mean?
Right,
Yeah.
yes.
You see, I was once a magazine editor, and I got very interested in the visual display of information. Up until then, you know, we had some anatomists, but they never quite figured out how to do layered drawings and, you know, page after page of getting it right. This is an incredibly beautiful drawing, but, you know, obviously the flesh is peeled off of this side. Flesh is, you know, it's not cut as deeply on this side. And so you can see, if you just had it, if you get the book and you cover up one side, it doesn't give you much information. But when you see it juxtaposed like that, it's a great way to do the visual display of information. And that is an underrated scientific discovery, because before then, we did not do visual displays of information that way. He even does it when he's working for Caesar Borgia.
This is a great example.
Yeah, he's working for Caesar Borgia with Machiavelli. They're in the town of Imola, which is this small, all winter. Any of you who are movie producers, the three of them in Imola, you know, Borgia, Machiavelli, and Leonardo. It, you know, seems like a great buddy movie to me. But he's been designing weapons of war for Caesar Borgia. God knows, you know, that's a problematic thing for me that he would serve such a warlord. But then, you know, his weapons of war aren't that practical. Then he does this, which becomes the most practical thing, because Machiavelli in his notes, and in The Prince, which is about Caesar Borgia, talks about the real weapon being the element of surprise, knowing where everyone is, what it is. And so by having an aerial view, which you have to remember is kind of hard to do back then because there are no drones, he just paced off Imola, knew how to do an aerial view that's almost straight, but actually is a bit of an angle, so you see three-dimensionality in different colors. And this gives, among other things, the military a real leg up, much more than a new type of cannon would. In fact, I've been a few times to the Defense Mapping Agency right outside Washington, and you look on the walls for Raqqa or, you know, various places, and I tell you, the maps look just like this.
Yeah, I mean, there's, I know Edward Tufte's famous book, and it is a real science, but Leonardo, I think I don't think there's any other, I haven't read every Leonardo biography, but there's none that says it as clearly as you say it, that is a real scientific discovery or invention that gets put to use in medicine, in war, but it has changed our world. That combination of quantitative analysis and visual display that I think he embodies. For me, it's maybe his greatest contribution
It's
somehow.
his greatest contribution to science. I mean, even the heart valve, which was a great discovery, you know, would have been discovered. But it also gets back to the very first thing you said, which is the essence of Leonardo and the essence of real creativity is this ability to see across disciplines and across patterns. So being able to connect design and art and display of information with scientific or other things. You know, no anatomist could have, somebody who's just an anatomist could have done this, and nobody who's just an artist could have done this, but somebody who loves to cross disciplines could have created the visual display of information field.
And we must talk about the fact that he presented himself in his famous letter asking for a job, which is well written about in your book, that he wanted to be a maker of war machines. He presented himself as that, having that power. It's kind of shocking when you look at that because of wanting to be known for that and spending so much of his productive life looking at making weapons.
A giant crossbow on the screen. That was the hardest thing, because he basically writes somewhat like a pacifist. He is a vegetarian, mainly because he doesn't want to hurt animals. He walks through the market and buys the birds in the cage and frees them so he can watch them fly. So he's not, he's not well, I won't get into modern politics, but he's not a warrior type. Yet he's reached this unnerving milestone of about to turn 30 when and he's messed up a bit in Florence as a young painter. He doesn't finish the Adoration of the Magi, for which his father had served as the notary on the contract for him to do it. Those of you who have 20-something kids that you've helped them get a job and they don't do it, you know what the relationship between Papa da Vinci and Leonardo may have been at that time. So he wanders off from Florence to Milan as part of a cultural delegation. This is something we forget today, too, that Florence did not have a great army, unlike Milan and other places, and its influence was it sent, we'll send you Michelangelo to paint your Sistine Chapel. It was one of the things that the Medici did to expand their influence, this soft power. So they send a delegation in 1482, I think it is, and it has a poet. It's led by a great playwright, theater people. They're all going to Milan, and Leonardo goes as a musician because he's designed a lira da braccia, a violin-like contraption in the shape of a lion's head. But then he writes a letter to the Duke of Milan because he clearly doesn't want to go back home where his father's saying, hey, you haven't finished that painting. And he's an 11-paragraph letter with which I begin the book and then explore it later in the book, in which the first 10 paragraphs are, I can build you, to the Duke, weapons of war. I can make great buildings and public spaces. I can divert the course of rivers. I can do all these engineering feats. And paragraph 11, the last numbered paragraph, is I can also paint. I think he wanted to put down the brush for a while, and I think he felt expanding his horizons to being an engineer, he needed to do it.
But is it because I'm struck by this, the vegetarian who doesn't want to hurt an animal, is it because, one, that's the only way to get a job? Do you see any conflict? Do you see that war is maybe so much part of everyday life that you can't avoid it, and so it's sort of we just don't see it that way? Because it's still, even when you look at the notebooks, it's still disturbing, the beautiful study of a face and the analysis of the body and spirituality, and just pages after pages of this kind of maniacal change the earth, destroy others.
This is a war machine that has scythes on the wheels, decapitating people.
Right.
I don't think it was the only way he could get a job. In fact, his war machines weren't that good, and as I said, right after he does it is when he's told, hey, try to build a cathedral instead. And it wasn't, it wasn't for the money, because he never danced to the tune of patrons, and he was somewhat of a pacifist, but there is this conflict in his soul. He is tormented at times. A lot of his writing is about huge deluges that kill people or horrible giants that destroy things. I think he went through dark just periods where this welled up in him. There's so many things, because he was so obsessive about certain things, and then so distracted at times he doesn't do things, so depressed at times, but almost manic in terms of the joyfulness of it all. I do think that you said I don't psychoanalyze him in the book, and I don't. I just give all this evidence. But nowadays they would have pulled down that, whatever it is, the diagnostic,
He would be on the spectrum.
He would be, and they would have put him on a pharmaceutical regiment, and he never would have painted the Mona Lisa.
Right, and history would have suffered. Yeah. This is what we say, like with the kids who don't quite fit in, which he was one. Yeah. So when you look, and I'm just going to pursue this a little because you've looked so closely at the drawings and I haven't. Do you see that coming in waves of time? Because he has fantasies of death and destruction, deluge. Are they interspersed in the notebooks? And I know he goes back and fills in pages. Do you feel that they come in waves and periods of his life, or do you feel they're always there?
I think when he was in his late 20s, he went through a really bad period. This is when he finally leaves Florence, and this is when some of these drawings come about. which is he's leaving Florence, and we have, tell me, has anything ever done? And then he says, he had been arrested for sodomy, too, around that time, twice. And both times it gets dismissed, but it clearly probably doesn't help the relationship with the father, who has been notarizing the contracts in which Leonardo's not finishing. I think St. Jerome is another of those. And so he has a really depressed period then. And I think that's why he leaves to go to Milan.
So, okay, so now we're on his depression and these different, and something that you, I think, try to tease out throughout is his humanity and failure, which is a theme you talk about through the genius books, that, geniuses are human, they fail. Leonardo's, it's odd because, most of his life is failure. I mean, almost,
and he tries to
right?
do impossible things and fails, such as squaring the circle, we said, building a human-powered flying machine. I mean, we're talking about 15, 20 years he's designing these things. You can't do it. We still haven't done it. I mean, you still need jet engines, not flapping contraptions. And even he does a perpetual motion machines. There is a lesson there, though, because he always seems to deepen after any one of these things, including squaring the circle, gets the Vitruvian Man. And, you think, okay, it's good to try the impossible. Even if you're not going to succeed, you're going to learn why it was impossible, and you're going to know something. It's also good to blur the line between fantasy and reality. In fact, if we're going to talk about the machines like this, let me, since we are in Los Angeles and have just done art and theater, I want to, one of the things people think about all of these flying contraptions and machines is that, he was this is a helicopter. He's invented the first helicopter. If you read the notebooks, you discover that many of these things started as props for the stage.
Theater, yeah.
His main job for the Medici when he was in his 20s, and then for the Duke of Milan when he wasn't, since the Duke said, no, you're not building the war machines.
All the way to the end.
All the way to the end. For the Francis I, when he's in his 60s, is designing plays, pageants, public spectacles, stage performances. They didn't have TV, they didn't have movies, whatever. And in the evenings, whether at the Medici or the Dukes, they would put on these grand pageants. It's the way they entertained all of the aristocracies and everything else. And this was for a particular play, the name of which I think is Danae, I can't remember what it was, in which the angels, let me look up there, have to come down from the rafters onto the stage, and he's designing this. But he blurs the line between fantasy and reality, and after designing a lot of these contraptions, he then, from the castle in Milan, starts doing gliders and real flying machines. And this is another lesson, which is allow your imagination to run wild, do fantasies, and then see if that makes you more of a visionary in the things you can invent. Much of what he invented didn't work at the time, but 100, 200 years later, people have gotten it to work.
So, yeah, and we can, you do at the end, you try to take advantage of that sort of list of failures to wrap it up into some kind of sense of hope. But I just did, not to dwell on it, but he finished almost nothing. The Last Supper, in all of his genius, he made a painting that fell apart almost immediately after it was made, which happened to him a couple times.
Yeah, the horse monument.
The horse monument that Michelangelo would rib him that he couldn't even make a bronze horse, which was another failure. It's interesting that the quantitative life is mostly that, and yet you do find this way of sensing that failure is genius, that reaching too far and changing yourself.
If you don't let your reach exceed your grasp, you're never going to be a genius. And if you let your reach exceed your grasp, you're going to fail a few times.
Or
Steve Jobs
mostly.
did, yeah. Ben Franklin did. Even Einstein. Yeah. I mean, the very last days of his life, he was still spending, after 30 years, trying to get a unified theory that brought together the forces of gravitation and those of quantum mechanics, and didn't do it. By the way, we still haven't done it. We still haven't built flying machines. We still haven't done perpetual motion, or squared the circle. There are things that we haven't been able to do. These people tried it and failed. But you are right to dwell on it a little, and maybe I dwell on it a little bit, not enough in the book. But I do say, his life is littered with rivers that weren't diverted, monuments that weren't made, paintings that weren't finished, treatises that weren't published, machines that weren't built. And at first, I saw that as whoa, I've been studying this guy for a while, and now I realize he's not so hot in some ways. And it took a while to wrap that in to the fact that he wasn't a master craftsman. He was somebody who let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So he didn't churn out the paintings the way his dad would have wanted him to. But when he finished them, especially the Mona Lisa and even the Last Supper, they were works of genius that were far different than anybody else.
Can we add my favorite, procrastination, to that list? Because
Yeah.
I read your book in the last 2 days, because that's usually what happens to me. I mean,
Well,
he
it
is
just came
the
out on
most
Tuesday.
famous procrastinator.
He actually writes when he's doing the Last Supper, which there it is. I'll put it there so you can see it in the refectory of the monastery in Milan, where the Duke had him do it. So he's up on a scaffold doing it, and by then he's famous, and also art is a public thing, just like you've made it on the plaza here. And so people come to watch him paint. It's like, okay, Leonardo's on today. As I say, there was no, you couldn't go on Facebook and waste time, so you went to go see Leonardo paint. But he was kind of dramatic. He'd blow in and get on the scaffold and just stand there for an hour, and then do one brush stroke, and then look at it for a while, and then leave. And so the Duke finally says, hey, let's get on with it. And Leonardo has a wonderful paragraph, which I use in the book, which is those who seem like they're working the least are often the most productive, because they've gathered all of their thoughts and letting them, I don't know if he doesn't use a word like marinate, but he's letting them come together until intuitions form. And so most of us don't need advice on, hey, why don't you procrastinate more? But in some ways, what Leonardo's telling us is get everything together and let it sit for a while until you have the right intuitions. And the Duke said, okay, fine, and he finished the painting. Now, as you said, it led to another flaw, because when you're doing a fresco, which this actually isn't, because it means you got to do it on wet plaster, and wet plaster dries, and if
You have to paint fast.
Yeah, and if you're painting the way Leonardo does, it doesn't work well on wet plaster. So he came up with a new method of painting on dry plaster that about 10, 12 years later became clear that was a mistake, because it began flaking.
Which was partly, it was both the slowness, and also he wanted to have that translucence that frescoes don't allow
He
for.
really wanted those glazes of oil, which the Netherlandish painters, the painters from Northern Europe, had just really invented, I think, you can tell me. Yeah. And it comes to Florence, and it's new, and Verrocchio doesn't do it, other people don't do it, but Leonardo's like, I love oil paint.
Which is partly because he wanted to remove, his observation of nature showed him that, unlike a drawing, there are no lines in nature. It is simply the relationship between shadow and light, and so you want a tool that allows you to not have that, which maybe is worth now observing closely. Can we go to the painting that's recently discovered? That was right.
Salvador Mundi?
Yes, the Salvador Mundi.
Yeah,
and then and then we can go to the Mona Lisa. Well,
here real quickly, because he, as I say, he doesn't get along with Leonardo.
Oh yes. Well,
I do what Michael just said, which is show that not only was it a personal feud and everything else, but Leonardo on the left painted like a sculptor, which Michael just said, sharp lines. Leonardo, from his own optics.
Michelangelo on
I'm
the
sorry,
left.
Michelangelo on the left,
Leonardo
painted
on the
like,
right.
yeah, my fault. Michelangelo painted on the left with sharp lines. Even people in the distance, always being male nudes in the case of Michelangelo, are sharply delineated, which is not the way we see nature, and Leonardo knew that. And so at the same time, this is Leonardo, and I'll let Michael explain sfumato, but
Well, yeah, it all fits together. His observation of nature that there are no lines, the observation that if the way we see is not the way we schematize, that the way we see has this aspect of many aspects of perspective beyond linear perspective. Everybody learns linear perspective in school where you have a point and everything goes into the distance and it looks smaller if it's further back. We today take that so for granted, but that was a recent discovery at this time. It changes the entire view of the world. That is the biggest discovery.
And real quickly, to go back, he does it as if he were a theater designer. He knows the rules of perspective, but he exaggerates a bit. Just like if you imagine scenery being on this stage. If you imagine the Chagall exhibition you had there, which is, you know, a great artist doing it for the theater, the scenery recedes a little too fast and all, but it's all done to make it give a greater sense of depth. And even if you see it in situ, there's the window of the real hull, and he uses that to light this wall of the painting. Right. So it's very theatrical.
Yeah, and the biggest difference between Leonardo's paintings and others of that time that incorporated perspective was that he had a list of different kinds of perspective, including aerial perspective, and you called it's complex perspective because he's adding together many different perspectival tricks to try to simulate not just the way we see, which is that things also get blurry in the background, they get bluer in the background because of atmosphere. Depending on when you have a big painting like this and you're moving around it, he couldn't use a one-point perspective because it would have looked worse if he had done it mathematically. And that's what's so incredible. Right after the invention of perspective, and every artist is sort of lining it up. You can see it in architecture, that he has this whole other complexity that comes out of observation. And so none of his pictures
But it also comes out, real quick since we're in Los Angeles, I think it comes from being a theater designer,
that's right.
too. You know how to do a few tricks.
Theater tricks, that's right. That's what you have. Even scrim or soft focus of light or flickering or... Well, there are fabric and textiles are so much part of theater and how they create that kind of illusion of something. And so, I mean, that is what's so astounding. I wonder if we could go to the Salvator Mundi because it's been and it is worth saying, though, Michelangelo excelled because he could paint. He learned how to do that on fresco, using lines seen at a distance, right? So he perfected something that Leonardo could not do in painting. Yeah. This is actually, this was presented to me 2 years ago as would the Los Angeles County Museum of Art be interested in buying a newly discovered Leonardo da Vinci. And I got all the materials, and I saw it early on when this was being presented. And I was like, well, we don't really have $100 million sitting around to buy a Leonardo da Vinci, but let's see. And so I spent a lot of time looking at this picture, which has now been shown in London and now been much discussed and has more or less been said. It's more or less been said that it is, at least in part, a Leonardo da Vinci based on assembling written records, connoisseurship, and everything else. But I love your discussion of the problem of it because of this sphere. And just as a maybe exercise in looking closely at painting, because most people don't do this every day, you got down to the point where you took all of that information about Leonardo da Vinci and you said, okay, so the curls are there in the hair, the gesture, we have the records that there was such a painting. We have the copy of it that's an engraving. We know there were many copies, so this is not necessarily Leonardo just because it's a painting.
We also know that the underdrawing here is changed, which a copyist wouldn't have done, so it's more likely not to be a copy.
We think. I mean, there are examples. More likely. These are all in the more likely category.
These are all little pieces of evidence that you try to accrue.
That's right. And it's the most fascinating thing for those here who may not be painting connoisseurs, and I don't mean people who like painting, I mean people who obsess for weeks, months, years, and most of their lives over the authenticity of a work of art and the debates going back and forth.
This is going on, it's in San Francisco today.
Yeah.
I think it's being shown in Los Angeles.
It's going to be for sale, and we're doing this because
it's going to be November 15th. It's going to be it's the only Leonardo in private hands. And it will go for well more than $100 million, I think. That's the minimum Christie's is putting on it. They showed it in San Francisco yesterday. I think it's being shown here before. It goes to New York on November 3rd to be shown. And anybody who has, I think, 150 million, which, by the way.
Which we are open to a gift.
Yeah. I know 100.
If
Look, I know
someone here is
150 million
interested,
sounds
just
like a
raise your
lot.
hand.
I know people, not that well, we both know a lot of wealthy people. I know people come to us who spend 150 million just on a sailboat. This is better to buy this and put it on permanent loan at LACMA.
would be.
And you
And
will be both a hero and you will own the only Leonardo da Vinci in private hands. Yeah.
So let's talk for a second, though, before we get to, you make this wonderful point about the glass orb.
Let me real quickly, if you don't mind.
Yes, go ahead.
Because we're talking about the science, and you just talked about the somato blur, that's the way you see things.
Which
in
he
the
often
back.
used his fingers, the telltale sign of a Leonardo
And
is
so
often
one telltale sign here is
find a fingerprint.
there is a palm print in the primer coat, so it's also the curls. But look at the hand. The hand is done differently, and it caused people to think it wasn't Leonardo because that is actually sharply delineated. As we said, or as Michael said, that Leonardo didn't do, Michelangelo did some pretty sharp lines. Now, that could say, well, that couldn't have been Leonardo. He wouldn't have drawn it so sharply. But he was doing his optics experiments, and you talked about 3 types of perspective. One of them is a type of perspective where things are sharper when they're closer to you. So my finger is now much sharper than your finger is when I see it because it's closer up to a point where it gets too close. And so by having this sharp, it makes it look like the hand is coming out at you.
Exactly
and that
right.
he's trying to do what you said is done with perspective, but by other means by Leonardo, which is to convey 3-dimensionality on a 2-dimensional panel. So the hand is sharp, and it's maybe because Leonardo wants it to seem like it's closer to you, that you're being blessed by Salvator Mundi, the savior of the world. Then you have the globe. Now, what is odd about the globe?
It's really odd.
It's really odd, and I'm going to show you, which is look at this glass of water, and imagine the microphone behind it, my finger behind it. You've seen it at dinner parties a lot. What happens in a very solid, this is a crystal solid, it distorts. In fact, it even turns things upside down. If I put my finger right, whatever it is, the robes of Jesus are not distorted in the least.
Nor is his hand.
Nor is his hand. But you see that. And if you now imagine that time you bought a crystal orb at Disney World or whatever, Disneyland, and looked through it and it was solid, how things look distorted behind it. Is that happening? You see 3 tiny dots here, which are perfectly done inclusions, meaning something in crystal. So there are 3 or 4 3 possibilities I'll mention. One is that Leonardo at that point just didn't know that crystal would distort.
Seems
Wrong.
unlikely.
Wrong. He's evaluating crystal sculptures and jewelry for Isabella d'Este, whose portrait he won't paint because he's painting some middle-class cloth merchant who has a wife named Lisa. So he's not painting Isabella d'Este, the richest woman in Italy, but he is helping her buy ornaments like that. So we know that, secondly, he's doing his optics experiments and mirrors. He knows how he's hundreds of drawings of light refracting. So Leonardo knows this isn't right. Explanation number 2, which I tended to accept in the book, is he knew that it should distort, but man, imagine it distorting, it would just screw up the whole painting. I mean, it would just be so distracting and messy that all you'd say, well, so he did it knowing that it should distort, but hey, just like I do tricks of perspective in the Last Supper, I'm just going to do something here because it'd be too distracting to do it right. The third explanation, which Luke Sison and others have, and I guess I could come around to, is he knew it would distort, and he knew very few people, but some people would know it would distort. And by not distorting it, he's conveying the miraculous quality of Christ as Savior of the world, that nothing in my hands is ever distorted. So don't pick explanation number 1, but you can pick explanation 2 or 3.
We have to end on the Mona Lisa. Your description of, the Mona Lisa, the most famous painting in existence, it almost can't be seen. If you go to Paris, it's behind thick glass. There are crowds. I was there once alone with my daughter, actually, and it was a really exciting experience. But people have talked about the smile and the mysterious quality of everything about Leonardo, all culminating in the one picture. So you give the most, I think, interesting analysis of that smile as being purposefully mysterious through the application of imagination, but science. And so the whole idea of the mysteriousness of her smile as being a product of science, in a way, and observation. So just to end, you end the book with this, and it's a different take on putting together his life, the anatomy study. So I wonder if you could take us through that.
The science is, there's many things that make it great, the art, the science, everything else. But throughout the book, there have been, there are various critics in the past, like Kenneth Clark, who said, if he had just not wasted all that time trying to do optics and trying to do dissections and all that, and worked on paintings, he'd be better. And my point is, no, the Mona Lisa answers that criticism with her smile. And so here's a little bit about the science. On the left, you see his optics drawings. He has dissected the human eye, in fact, even put it in an egg white to make sure it stays flat, so that he can figure out that the retina of a human eye, the exact center of the retina, is where you see the finest of detail. True. On the edges of the retina, the cones that see shadows. And so, depending if you're looking directly at something versus whatever, different things will pop out at you. They're page after page of the dissection of the eye. He also has about 14 pages dissecting the human lips. He peels the face off of at least 30 cadavers and has every single muscle and every single that touches the lip, and even discovers things that you and I could have discovered, which is that the bottom lip is a muscle, but the top lip isn't. So you can do that with your bottom lip, but you can't do that with your top lip. You need your bottom lip to help you move your top lip. Okay, everybody can try it and look silly for a second. Trust me, this is Leonardo describing that, all the things of the lips. There are other pages in which he's showing whether the nerves go to the brain or go to the spinal cord. Exactly how does a smile work? And he even has in his list of things to do, explain how a smile works. So in all of these anatomy drawings explaining it, this is like one of the later pages he does. Suddenly, you see him pick up a different type of piece of chalk, and there's a faint sketch, and that's the smile that's going to become the most famous smile ever made. So this page is almost too direct of a connection between science and art. But for those who doubt there's a connection, I say look at this page. So what you get is the Mona Lisa. You have everything Leonardo has ever done. The curving of waters going into the roads of civilization, into the blood and veins of the human. The connection of the human to the earth, to the cosmos. You have the eyes, which you talked about, but the main thing is that smile. Now, if you look really closely at the smile, and you get a high-resolution photograph of it, or I got to go one of those days where nobody is there and they let you see it, the tiniest of details at the corner of the lip, there's even a tiny one here, turned down slightly. If you look really directly at the corner of her lips, she suddenly does not look like she's smiling at you. But the shadows and the colors obviously all turn upward. So when you're looking at her, if you look directly at her smile, the more you search for it, the less you see it. But then your eye wanders to her chin or her cheekbone or her forehead or even to the rivers, and the smile flickers on. Because he knows that the light hitting your retina is hitting a different part of the retina. It's out of the corner of your eye, so to speak, and suddenly she's smiling at you. Every time you look at her, there's a different interaction. What is she thinking? What is she feeling? What inner emotions are being shown by her gestures? All of that is a culmination of a lifetime spent figuring out everything you could possibly know about everything that can be known about our cosmos, including how we fit into it. And you have the smile that's interactive and elusive.
Thank you. Thank you, Walter. Thank you.